Alright, once again, another updated deck profile. This time on Set 8 Artiseria. Originally introduced as a Set 7 deck, but I didn't do a deck profile at the time because it was going to be playing with a bunch of generic cards, so I would just wait until Set 8 to make the deck feel more complete. As usually in the Rhylight, the first set that introduced it usually makes it feel a little incomplete, but the next set usually makes it feel more complete, which is why I decided to do the deck profile now. And I do have to say, the deck still runs into the same issues practically as in Set 7 when it was first introduced, but a little better, as even with that one new card, it does feel like it's a little more complete. Because in Set 7, you had to play a bunch of generics, but in Set 8, not as much of course, and overall it's just a pretty awesome deck. In a way, it's basically the same playstyle as Orphis. It's a lyrical version of Orphis with a Link Joker aesthetic, that also brought back one huge big mechanic, which is Lock. Yes, out of all decks to bring back Lock, it is a new Rhyline that has a power of Link Joker, and it's not Link Joker itself, or the descendant of Link Joker being the Cardinals with Orphis. Out of all decks to bring back Lock. And as you can tell, we have a new Shadow Army, which this is basically Artiseria's version of the Shadow Army token. Also because you can't use the original one with the Artiseria, as that is a brand gate restricted one, while this new version is nationless, hence why you have to use this new Shadow Army token. But other than that, the deck basically plays similar to Orphis, with one big huge hindrance, which is going to be on the set orders. But anyway, let's just begin with the deck profile with, of course, the Ride deck. So starting off with the Grade 0, Pruta, in which we go to the Grade 1, Artiseria. So the Grade 1 has the skill where when you place it by riding on top of the Grade 0, you search your deck for a sound system card, aka the set order for the deck, and add it to your hand, by needing to reveal the Grade 3 of the Ride deck, which wouldn't even matter anyway. Which the Grade 2 has the exact same skill, so there's really nothing to say about there. But then we go to the Grade 3, Polyphonic Overdrive Artiseria, which has 3 skills. The first one, not very important, it's a bonus skill where during your turn, if you have at least 2 sound system cards in your order zone, crit +1. So extra crit pressure, always pretty nice, until you're going to see the fact that, spoiler, you can only use it on turn 4 and onward at the moment. Because the second skill, which is actually pretty good, which is Act once per turn, Energy Blast 2, choose a sound system card from your hand or drop zone and put it into the order zone, making all the sound systems that you search from your ride line into discard fodder, which is actually very nice. And if you do put it from your hand, you draw a card. So if you do have extra sound systems in your hand and you play it from hand, you can do a little cycling, which is also pretty nice right there. Now, spoiler alert, the sound systems can only be used by this skill, and there's no other ways to use the sound system. Which is why it's going to be a huge flaw for the first skill, because if in normal circumstances where you could play a sound system and then use this skill to play additional sound system, then you would get the crit +1 on your very first Grade 3 ride. But with the sound system being restricted to only Artiseria herself, that means that you can only play once a turn. And that's the big flaw about this deck already. And it makes it even worse with the last skill because it actually hinders the last skill as well, where auto, once per turn when this card attacks, counterblast 1, call the same number of Shadow Army tokens equal to the number of sound systems in your order zone. And then for every 2, plus 5k to the front row. This part I kind of get with the multi-attack part to basically avoid early rush in a practical sense. But considering that you can only play 1 sound system per turn just through her own skill, that kind of sucks that you only get 4 attacks on your very first Grade 3 ride, with of course no extra power, which I get it if you went first, but if you went second and you only call 1, that's very lackluster. But other than that, there is potential for the deck, especially because mainly with the second skill where you could play that 1 sound system, and of course if they make a sound system in the future or another way to replay the skill where you could play both sound systems in 1 turn, this deck would be actually pretty decent. But right now it is kind of lackluster because of the fact that you are really hard restricted to 1 sound system per turn. And speaking of sound system, this deck revolves around needing those sound systems. And so that's it for the ride line. To the main deck, of course, 3 more for Persona. And then continuing off to the 2 sound system cards. So I'm running 3 of each Shout of Shadow and Megaloroniga. You can tell which one is which because this one has the reverse R. So because of reverse R reasons, that's obviously going to be the Link Joker one, and both of them have the restriction where you can only play it through Artiseria, so it cannot be played. Which of course is already a very restrictive thing, but the main skill is the second part where Shout in Shadow, which is the one that you're always going to use first usually if you first ride Grade 3, or use it if your opponent's controlling their own rearguards. So when placed, you can call Shadow Army token and you draw a card. That is very nice because it's a +2 and it doesn't matter if your opponent's at grade 3 or not. While Megaronica literally chooses one of your opponents to lock, but your opponent has to be at least at grade 3. Yep, they literally brought back lock, which is actually a strong point about this deck because of the lock mechanic. You can lock, of course, the front row, which could equal multi-attack, and that is very huge for this deck. Now, against certain matchups, it might not be as good, mainly the ones that have super duper multi-attack, but against 3 attack decks, it does make a huge difference. Against those decks that control their own board, not that great. So it does just depend on scenario. So far, these are the only 2 sound systems we got, and I don't think they're going to really make any more because each of these sound system is basically one side of Artiseria's speaker. So I don't see them making any more sound systems in the future, unless if they make a card that counts as both, or 2, they actually give out a support that lets you play additional sound system ignoring the condition. But what we got is what we got. These aren't exactly too bad, just hate the fact that they're completely restricted to Artiseria skill only. And so to continue with the grade 3 lineup, we got Rotroria, which this one gets plus 5k power for every sound system in your order zone. First grade 3 turn, 18k, second grade 3 turn, 23k. This is not too bad, counts as its own big beater aside your Shadow Army token. And also when returned from hand during your turn, or retired during your turn, because Shadow Armies will be calling on top of it, you can Soul Blast 1 while your Vanguard's Artiseria to choose one of your units to get plus 5k. You'll use this sometimes, but the deck doesn't really use much Soul, which is actually very nice. So it does play a little bit of a role, especially being a big beater on its own, hence why I do kind of run it, and we do have a little bit of space. But any better cards that come out in the future, this is definitely going to be removed from the deck. And now to the grade 2 lineup, starting off with Lufer, on place, on Rearguard and Guardian, plus 5k power, 5k shield, which is always very helpful. In which the second skill is that if returned from Rearguard to hand or retired from Rearguard during your turn, you can counterblast 1 to draw a card. Once again, since his lyrical bouncing is easy, and considering that you're also calling Shadow Army, just in case you can't bounce, calling on top of this is fine. And into a new card that actually helps out the deck, Lumiel. So Lumiel, when placed on Rearguard, reveal an Artiseria from your ride deck, and if you have a grade 3 Vanguard Artiseria or your ride deck is that card, you can Energy Blast 2 to call Shadow Army token. But it cannot attack during the turn. This is still very huge even if it can't attack during the turn, because that means that you get an early game booster even if it's on your grade 2 turn, which is actually very huge because that can actually change up numbers and your opponent planning a guard, which is already very nice. And considering that the deck doesn't really use much energy, that's also a huge plus, especially since this could be bounced back and then just reused for more Shadow Army. And this is one of the cards that actually build up your Shadow Armies even faster because Artiseria itself can only really get 1 additional Shadow Army per turn. Each extra grade 3 ride means more Shadow Army, and by your second grade 3 ride, it's only 2 Shadow Armies, so it's not really that great. But this one actually speeds it up, which is actually very nice. But also has additional skill where when put on Guardian while your Vanguard is at least a grade 3 Artiseria, you can retire as many Shadow Army tokens as you want, and this card gets plus 10k shield for each one. Considering that in a way you will be calling a bunch of Shadow Army, especially because if you use this one quite often, you might actually have a board of 5 Shadow Armies and then you can make a 55k shield with this. I have actually on average experienced a 25k to 35k shield with this card, which is actually what makes this card a little crazy, hence why this is a must run 4 of in the deck. And then finally, Lucio, the Persona Ride Cycler. You can run whichever one you want, but considering the deck doesn't really use Soul, I think this is the best one. And now to the grade 1 lineup. Reverbria. So if your order zone has a sound system, plus 5k, and then at the end of battle this card boosts while your order zone has a sound system, put this as Soul, and then choose one of your rearguards and return it back to your hand. It's basically a archetype version for Yuka, but more budget friendly, and it goes to Soul, which could help you with the resources sometimes depending on matchup. And depending on the future, you might need this even more. And then for Yuka, just for more ways to bounce back, and also because if you call Shadow Army on front of it, that will still get plus 5k, so it does do something. And then finally 4 PGs, because PGs. And then for the trigger lineup, OT, run whichever one you want. 8 crits, 3 fronts, because in a way you actually do draw a lot and get a lot of pluses back to your hand, so draws are not completely necessary in this deck. And 4 heals, 2 being counters. And so that's it for this deck profile on my Artiseria deck. What do you guys think of it? What other cards would you recommend? And what other changes would you make? So far, how I built the deck, this is actually how I kind of like it. There might be other cards worth testing out, considering that there are still some space that you can actually swap out. And in a way, you can say this deck can be a bit budget if you take out the generics, because most of the cards are not that expensive. It is a bit popular, but the cards itself are not entirely expensive, and in a way, it's kind of simple to play. You just set your stuff and then just do some stuff. And honestly, other than its cool design, I do still feel the deck's being lackluster, and it's basically just Lyrical Orpheus. It's not as cool as Orpheus, because Orpheus can do a little more stuff, obviously, since that's an older deck. But other than that, it did bring back one huge big mechanic, which is the lock mechanic. That one was a huge surprise when they first brought it back, and that is kind of one of the reasons why I played the deck too, because of its lock mechanic that it brought back, and also its cool design for Lyrical. But in that, there's really not much to say about this deck other than it kind of needs some stuff. Hopefully it does get its own evolved form for basically the character's development, and hopefully it doesn't get forgotten, because that's what I'm actually kind of afraid of right now. But on that, that's it for this, and see you all next time.